Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Access Mob Community Lecture Night. My name is Elisa Grishman, and I am the founder and director of Access Mob Pittsburgh. I am a fat white woman with brown curly hair, and I am wearing a shirt that says vote, only the V is books that are propped together. The O is a white circle with a raised black fist in it. The T is a uterus, and the E has the Progress Pride flag. So that's my empowerment message for tonight. I want to welcome everyone to our lecture. Tonight's topic is voting is an act of resistance. Before we get into things, I want to thank so much my board of directors, Debbie, Donna, Kendra, Mallory, Monica, Nyota, and a huge welcome to our newest board member, Reggie. I also want to thank Katie, who is our tech lead and host for this evening. I want to thank Disability Pride Pennsylvania. They are our fiscal sponsor. They are our reason for being, and we're enormously grateful. And then a million thanks to the Opportunity Fund, whose funding is helping us run this lecture series. Before we begin, I want you to know that this is being recorded and will be available for watch on YouTube afterwards. I will be sending out later tonight a survey for people to fill out with, letting us know how we did, how we can improve in the future. And when that goes out, I'll send out a link to the recording of the video as well if you want to rewatch it. Closed captions are available, and a link to the transcript will be in the chat. We ask that everyone please remain muted with your cameras off. Keep track. Please stay muted unless you are specifically called on. The chat is disabled between participants. You may create a new chat with Access Mob Pittsburgh, who is our host, in the chat if you have a question or problem. If you need to see how, there is a link being posted now. If there is a time for a Q&A at the end, please raise your hand with the virtual reaction or let the facilitator, Access Mob Pittsburgh, know if you have a problem and wait to be called on. You will be asked to unmute and or turn on your camera. You may ask your question verbally or in ASL, or type questions into the chat for Access Mob to read out loud. Do not turn on your camera unless you need to speak ASL and wait for the interpreter to acknowledge you. For those who are calling in on their phones, you can hit *9 to raise or lower your hand and *6 to mute or unmute. If you have questions that you come up with later, or if we don't have time for questions, please email any questions you have to Access Mob Pittsburgh. That's Access, ACCESS, Mob as in Flash Mob, MOB, and then Pittsburgh, PITTSBURGH @gmail.com. I said that I'd be sending out a survey. We may be able to send out a copy of the slides. I don't have no promises on any of that yet, but I will be sending out a survey as soon as possible. So with that, I want to welcome our speaker, if I can separate my papers. Sorry. Mallory Hudson is a Disability Justice Program Director at Keystone Progress Education Fund. Mallory is a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh, where she studied psychology, studio arts, social work, and public health. Over the last decade, Mallory has worked in the disability community across a wide range of settings, including healthcare, research, community mental health, and home and community-based services. So without further ado, welcome Mallory.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? All right. So, like Elisa said, my name is Mallory. I also go by Mal, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman with medium length brown hair. I am wearing glasses with pink lenses for migraine prevention. Highly recommend. I also have silver nose rings, and I'm wearing a gray shirt with a teal sweater. And behind me, you can see a bookcase. All of my books are arranged in like a rainbow instead of by author. And I also have some artwork behind me, one of them including a blue and red adapt poster. All right, so we're going to get started. So we're just going to open up really broadly with the topic of democracy. I originally planned to have people actually submit comments or questions about, what democracy means to them, and, if there is any kind of disconnect between their experience of democracy and, what it means, what like the definition means. But I forgot that we don't have the Zoom chat. So instead, I'm just going to read the definition out loud for folks. So democracy is a framework of governance built on the principle that power resides within the people. In a democracy, citizens exercise authority either directly or indirectly through elected representatives, ensuring that government decisions reflect the collective will of the people while protecting their individual rights. It's a living system that directly impacts your daily life, from school, local board decisions to national policy directions. So it's a lot more than just voting in elections, right? So this includes our protection of our individual rights, the rule of law in our country, and the ability of people to thrive and build a shared future. I do need to pause for one moment because my cats are getting into a fight. Sorry, guys. Never mind. They've been separated for me. Okay, so to our next. I keep accidentally pausing. Okay, we're going to move on to our next slide here. So I think everyone here is probably aware that we live in a democracy, but specifically we live in a representative democracy. And this means essentially that, our citizens, we elect government officials who represent our ideas and concerns of those constituents in the government. So you can probably imagine this is an imperfect system. There are times when we elect people who say they will do one thing and then they do something else. And it's an imperfect system, but it's what we're working with right now. Like we said, though, democracy, it's a lot more than just voting. It's a lot more than just elections, right? There are a lot of ways to participate. Obviously, in addition to voting, getting registered to vote, and voting in every election, you can also sign up to be a poll worker. You can volunteer for or donate to candidates who you believe in. You can contact your elected officials outside of elections to discuss issues in your community or to share feedback about proposed legislation. Elected officials care a lot more when their constituents who are registered voters are the ones calling them and giving feedback. You can also submit public comment about proposed policy changes from other parts of our government. So we have like appointed officials, right, who work in Health and Human Services or Department of Justice. When they make changes to their policies, there's like a public comment period, and you can actually provide public comment on these things, and it has to be acknowledged. It doesn't always change things, but if in like 2023, a really good example of this, the US Census had proposed some changes to the 4 questions that they use to determine whether or not a census participant has a disability. And the way they proposed changing those questions was going to dramatically undercount the number of people with disabilities in the United States. And it already kind of undercounts that group of people, but also it was going to, those proposed changes were going to be so much worse. And that's important because the census impacts our voting districts. It also impacts how much funding different communities get for different public services and goods, right? It can affect Medicaid funding, for example, in your area. So it's really important that we pay attention to these things. Obviously, elections are super important, and also there are a lot of other ways to participate in our democracy. So it doesn't end, when the election day is over. Some other things that folks can do, you can submit a letter to the editor of your local newspaper. You can talk online with people about your experiences and your thoughts and changes you'd like to see in your community. You can also attend community meetings. There are lots of different community boards and neighborhood associations. You can go to public meetings like your local school board meeting or your city council meeting. Those are also great places to give feedback to our elected and our appointed officials. And joining community groups are great ways to build a stronger, more powerful community and to just know people in your area. So I highly recommend it always. Okay, so next on this slide, we're gonna talk a little more specifically about voting for a few minutes. And we're gonna start by talking about our constitutional voting rights. So here on this slide, on the left, I have some text that I'm going to read out loud to you, and on the right, I have a timeline that I will also read. So I'm going to start with the text on the left. It says, constitutional voting rights. When the U.S. Constitution was originally drafted in 1787, it gave states the responsibility of overseeing federal elections, which included determining who was qualified to vote in federal elections. At that time, most state legislatures restricted voting to white men who own land, and some states were even more restrictive, only allowing Christian white landowning men to vote in their states. Constitutional amendments were later ratified, making other groups eligible to vote as well. So some of these key things after the Constitution, which is at the top of our timeline here, which was signed in 1787 and gave states the responsibility of overseeing our federal elections and including determining who's qualified to vote in those elections. Next, we have in 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed. This gave African American men the right to vote primarily. The way it was written, it says that you cannot restrict voting on the basis of race, but at that time, Native Americans were still broadly not considered U.S. citizens if they were members of a tribe, and also folks like any kind of Asian immigrant or Asian American was not yet considered a citizen, so they couldn't vote either. So it mostly just allowed African American men to vote, starting in 1870. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, giving, again, many women the right to vote. In 1964, the 24th Amendment was passed, which eliminated poll taxes. In 1971, the 26th Amendment was passed, and this lowered the voting age to 18 years old.
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me? I'm so sorry. No. Let me try to turn myself up.
Thank you.
Is this any better? Is this better? All right, I'm going to assume it's better unless someone lets me know. Okay. So we're going to move on to the next slide. Oop. We have an error here. Let me scoot back. One of my slides is missing. That's okay. I can just give you guys a description of what was on my other slide. So the next slide, we have a description of the term voter suppression. So voter suppression is the legal and extra-legal practices aimed at discouraging or preventing specific groups of people from exercising the right to vote, often disproportionately affecting marginalized communities. So the reason I bring that up after talking about, the U.S. Constitution or constitutional amendments is because we still had to pass so many federal laws to protect voters. A few specific laws that apply specifically to disabled voters include the Voting Rights Act, the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Disabled Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the National Voter Registration Act, and the Help America Vote Act. Oh, okay. My slide came up this time. Oh, great, wonderful. I don't know what happened. But yeah, so I will read a little bit more about federal laws that protect the rights of disabled voters. Again, this slide is set up the same as my last timeline. So most of the text is on the left, and then there is a timeline with some text on the right explaining the timeline. So while the U.S. Constitution and its amendments, broadly defined our eligibility criteria to vote in the United States, they did not provide very many protections against voter suppression, right? So all these other federal laws were passed to protect Americans' right to vote and to make it easier for U.S. citizens to exercise their voting rights. So the Voting Rights Act allows disabled voters to receive assistance casting their ballot from a person of their choice, and also prohibits eligibility requirements such as requiring the ability to read or write, other requirements like educational achievement or passing some kind of interpretation test. The Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Disabled Act was passed in 1984. This requires accessible polling places for older adults and people with disabilities. When accessible voting places aren't available, then voters must be provided an alternate means of voting on election day. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm not saying the name of this act correctly, so it's technically called the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act. So if you look it up, you'll see that it's often referred to as the VAEHA, but I kind of automatically translate the H word because I don't like to use it. All right, so we'll move on to the next one. In 1991, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. Specifically, Title II of the ADA requires state and local governments to ensure that people with disabilities have full and equal opportunity to vote. And this applies to all aspects of voting, including voter registration, polling place site selection, election websites, and the casting of ballots. In 1993, we passed the National Voter Registration Act. This requires all offices that provide public assistance or state-funded programs that primarily serve people with disabilities to also provide the opportunity to register to vote in federal elections. So if anyone in this Zoom has ever been on Medicaid or food stamps or TANF, something like that, you have probably, in recent years, right, since 1993, you have probably been asked if you were interested in registering to vote when you were applying for those services. And then in 2002, we passed the Help America Vote Act, which authorized federal funding of elections and created the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, which helps states comply with the Help Americans Vote Act so that they can adopt, minimum standards on voter education, registration, and ballots, including requiring every polling place have at least one accessible voting system. Okay, so this slide and then my next slide both have huge charts on them. It is not necessary to know everything that's on the chart. It's more meant to give you to kind of illustrate general trends. That being said, for accessibility, I am going to describe the chart and highlight a few important things. So the top of the chart here says, so we have essentially 3 columns and 7 different rows going across. The first column just says the year. The second column says constitutional amendments and federal voting rights laws. And then the last column, all the way on the right, says, I'm having a hard time seeing it, like voter suppression tactics. So we go from 1787 with the US Constitution being passed to 1790 with the Naturalization Act of 1790. In 1868, we had the 14th Amendment. In 1870, we had the 15th Amendment. Already talked about those a little bit. In 1870, we also passed the Civil Rights Act of 1870, which was also called the Enforcement Act or the first Ku Klux Klan Act. In 1920, we passed the 19th Amendment, and in 1922, we passed the Cable Act of 1922. That was also called the Married Women's Independent Nationality Act. So I have all of those laid out. I do want to highlight some of these specific like federal voting rights legislation because I didn't have them listed on a previous slide. And they also highlight some of the important things about citizenship and how citizenship has been used to keep our neighbors from voting and also how it enables us to vote. So in 1790, the Naturalization Act was passed, and essentially this is when Congress defined eligibility for US citizenship by naturalization. And this was limited to, quote, free white persons. Essentially, only white male property owners could naturalize and become US citizens, while non-white people, women, and indentured servants who had immigrated to the United States could not naturalize. But obviously, moving forward, we passed the 14th Amendment to establish birthright citizenship regardless of parentage, granting full US citizenship to people who were formerly enslaved and naturalized individuals. But I mentioned earlier that this excluded a lot of Native American folks because they were not considered US citizens on the basis of their tribal membership. And then I talked a little bit about the 15th Amendment earlier, which prohibited states from denying anyone the right to vote based on race, which mostly gave African American men and some Native American men who were not associated with tribes, and other like non-Asian immigrant men the right to vote. So I'm going to pause here and look at some of the voter suppression tactics that were relevant during those time periods. Like we mentioned earlier, state legislatures obviously defined qualified voters, which included white men who own land. Some states were even more restrictive, only allowing white Christian men to vote. Jim Crow laws were very relevant at this time. So these included, related to voting, this included things like poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, all-white primary elections in Texas, and felony disenfranchisement laws. And you might notice the felony disenfranchisement laws still exist in a lot of states to this day. Also relevant information, obviously, the KKK used violence and other forms of voter intimidation, like threats of termination from employment or eviction, to keep Black and Native American men from voting. And that is the reason why, right, we had to pass that is one of the contributing factors, right, why we had to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1870, which was also called the Enforcement Act or the first Ku Klux Klan Act. And this law essentially deemed it a felony to conspire against citizens exercising their constitutional rights, which actually made voter interference a federal crime. And in response to that, right between 1875 and 1924, the United States Congress also passed a variety of, not even a variety, it's slightly different versions of the same thing. Congress passed a lot of federal exclusionary immigration laws, which prohibited entry into the United States by Asian laborers and suspected sex workers. These also laws that made Chinese residents ineligible for U.S. citizenship until the 1950s. These laws also prohibited Chinese laborers from re-entering the United States after traveling abroad. They required Chinese residents to register and carry ID certificates with them, otherwise they could be deported. They also established immigration quotas, severely limiting entry from Asian and African countries, and seriously favoring immigrants from Europe. And there was also a law that required military service as a naturalization requirement, specifically for Filipino immigrants. So all of these are different things that kept specifically a lot of Asian immigrants and Asian American folks from having citizenship and being able to vote. So after the Civil Rights Act of 1870 passed, deeming it a felony to, interfere in elections, most Native American men and women who had tribal membership still did not have their U.S. citizenship at that time in the 1870s, so they weren't permitted to vote. After the 19th Amendment was passed, which gave many women the right to vote, there were still laws that restricted women from voting. So one of those laws was that women would lose their U.S. citizenship and therefore the right to vote if they married an immigrant man who is not a U.S. citizen. Another example is that Asian American women and women in Puerto Rico who were unable to read were not allowed to vote until 1952 and 1935 respectively. And then at the bottom here we have the Cable Act of 1922, which was the Married Women's Independent Nationality Act. This law granted independent U.S. citizenship to American women. So those who married immigrant men who were eligible for naturalization, which means non-Asian immigrants, would not automatically lose their U.S. citizenship when they married a non-U.S. citizen. And also another voter suppression tactic, right? So one, it restricted who they could marry to keep their rights. It also meant that women could actually lose their U.S. citizenship if they lived outside of the United States for more than 2 years, which is just not a law we had for men at the time. All right, so I'm going to go to the next slide, which has a very similar chart. I ended up reading through pretty much the last chart, and I do think it is worth it to read through the highlights on this one as well. So the same setup, we have 3 columns, year on the left, middle column has constitutional amendments and federal voting rights legislation, and then all the way on the right we have voter suppression tactics that were relevant at that time. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different laws here. And, this slide and last slide, these do not encompass all of the voting rights laws. They do not encompass all of the voter suppression tactics. This is just meant to give you a lot of the highlights and to show you a trend that every time we pass a law to enable people to vote, other laws or non-laws, right, other tactics occur to keep eligible people from voting. And this has pretty much always been the case in the United States, and unfortunately, it is still the case today. So we're just gonna move on down our chart here. We have in 1924 the Snyder Act, which was also called the Indian Citizenship Act. This was the law that actually granted full U.S. citizenship, including voting rights, to all Native Americans born in the U.S. State legislatures, in response, still tried to limit the right to vote for Native Americans, even, right, including everyone, all those born in the U.S., by passing laws that restricted those who lived on reservations from voting. So if you lived on a reservation, even after the Snyder Act was passed, and you were still considered a full U.S. citizen, in a lot of states, you still could not vote in a federal election. And that was I think that was both in Colorado and New Mexico for quite a while. In 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act passed. This granted people of Asian ancestry the right to become U.S. citizens, which was, the entryway into getting the right to vote. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. This dismantled our Jim Crow laws, which included those literacy tests and grandfather clauses. In 1964, we also passed the 24th Amendment, which eliminated poll taxes. That still was not enough, so in 1965, we had to pass the Voting Rights Act, and this required state and local jurisdictions with a history of racist voter suppression to, when they want to change laws and jurisdictions, like voting laws and jurisdictions in their area, they actually have to submit those changes to the U.S. Department of Justice for approval prior to enacting the changes, so that the Department of Justice can ensure that these changed laws or changed jurisdictions aren't going to disproportionately affect people of color primarily. The Voting Rights Act also allowed disabled voters to receive assistance in casting their ballot from a person of their choice, and it prohibited imposing eligibility requirements such as the ability to read or write, educational achievement, or passing an interpretation test. In 1971, then, we lowered the voting age to 18 years old using the 26th Amendment. In 1984, we passed the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Disabled Act, which required, like we said, accessible polling places for older adults and people with disabilities. 1991 was the Americans with Disabilities Act. 93 was the National Voter Registration Act, and 2002 was the Help America Vote Act. So between 1952 and now, this is still ongoing, we have experienced a lot of different voter suppression tactics in the United States. So gerrymandering, which is used to severely dilute the voting power of communities that have been historically marginalized, so primarily Black and Brown voting districts, as well as lower income voting districts. That is still a problem to this day, and it's been going on for a very long time. State voting laws that disenfranchise young adults to this day. These are things that vary a lot state by state, and in Pennsylvania, even county by county. So things that disenfranchise young adults would include a lack of funding for civics education, not allowing same-day voter registration, not accepting a school ID, not accepting digital school IDs as a voter ID, and not allowing people to pre-register to vote earlier than, a couple months before the election, the first election after they turn 18. Some state voting rights laws that specifically disenfranchise disabled people would include inaccessible polling places, requiring an excuse verified by a medical provider and notary to vote by absentee ballot. We've really benefited from universal mail-in ballots. Lack of braille ballots and inaccessible ballot marking devices, which eliminate not just independence, but the privacy of blind voters. The lack of remote accessible ballot return options. We actually have remote accessible ballot return options in some states, but not in every state. And it is obviously not a federal law. We also have state laws that automatically remove voting rights from disabled adults who have guardians. That is a law in West Virginia currently to this day. Some more recent things also include the Supreme Court's 2013 decision by Shelby County versus Holder, which eliminated the Justice Department's authority to block changes to voting laws in states that have a history of racial discrimination. So the Supreme Court's 2013 decision there really undermined the Voting Rights Act. Nationally, some states have their own Voting Rights Act, and I wish we had one in Pennsylvania. And since 23, state legislatures have enacted more and more voter suppression tactics as laws. So states have been passing more restrictive voter ID laws. They've been strategically and excessively purging state voting rolls. The discriminate closures of polling locations, right? Making polling places in areas where a majority of marginalized people vote, closing those because not enough people vote there. That is just voter suppression. And underfunding election staff, underfunding training for those staff and for volunteers, and then not providing enough funding for equipment that makes our elections accessible. So those are all voter suppression tactics that are still going on to this day, and they've been going on for a very long time. All right, we're going to move to the next slide here. I have another timeline, but this one is much shorter. This is a more recent example of voter suppression or attempted voter suppression in the last couple of years. So this timeline here goes from July 4th, 2025 up until now, essentially. And I'm just going to read through each thing in the timeline, and then we'll talk about it a little. So on July 4th, 2025, a lot of folks probably remember that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was signed into law. This mandated the largest cuts to Medicaid in the history of the Medicaid program. So essentially it told Congress that they have to make those cuts when they put together their budget for the next year, for 2026 and beyond. On January 3rd of 2020, that should say 2026, not 2025. January 3rd, 2026, or no, that was January 3rd, 2025. I just have them in the wrong order. So even before the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was signed into law, in January of that year, the SAVE Act was introduced into the United States House of Representatives. A different version had previously been introduced in our last Congress, either in 2023 or 24. It was very similar to the one that was passed in the current Congress in 2025. So the SAVE Act does a lot of things. Some of the main things that it would do if it were passed is it would require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote. It would end third-party voter registration and mandate in-person voter registration. It would require voter ID just to cast a ballot. It would end universal mail-in voting and create new barriers for absentee voters. So that was introduced. It has not been passed into law. Then we had the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in July of last year, And in January of this year, the Save America Act was introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives. It really just builds on the SAVE Act. So it has everything that the SAVE Act had, plus some more terrible things, including requiring photo ID. So not just a voter ID, but a photo ID and documentary proof of citizenship to cast any ballot. So whether that is casting your ballot in person, or if you are one of the few people who is able to get an absentee ballot, you then also have to provide photocopies of your photo ID and your documentary proof of citizenship to send your absentee ballot back to the elections office so it can be counted. And then also in January of 2026, I think the next day, the MEGA Act was passed. It was not passed. None of these have passed. It was introduced into the U.S. House of Representatives. This built on requirements, again, of the SAVE Act and the Save America Act. And then it also is proposing new mandates to frequently purge the voter rolls, to severely limit assistance from designated agents, which are those folks who can help you vote if for some reason you are not able to do it independently. It would also allow election officials to purge the voter rolls during the 90 days before an election, which is currently not allowed. It would allow the Attorney General to withhold election funds and to ban ranked choice voting and a whole lot more. None of these acts or bills have been passed. They have only been proposed. I will say the Save America Act did come to a vote last week, or the Senate was having a hard time getting it to come to a vote because they didn't have enough senators in support willing to discuss it. So then kind of a standalone bill was added to a different bill that was then discussed by the Senate, and they really just talked about like voter ID, and that did not pass. But what we should all remember here is that even though these things haven't passed, the folks who are proposing this legislation have had a somewhat successful communications campaign around these ideas that, voter ID, photo ID, documentary proof of citizenship are valid things that we should be doing, and also that they won't disproportionately hurt our most marginalized neighbors, right? And that they're not a poll tax. I mean, getting a new ID is expensive, So finding, if you don't have access to your proof of citizenship, which like half of Americans don't have that on hand, then you have to go through some government entity, depending on what you're accessing or depending on what you're requesting, and spend money and time getting that to you. So it adds a lot of barriers to voting regardless. And the reason I picked this example, right, first, we're talking about some voting laws here, but I also mentioned the Medicaid cuts. So the folks in office, a lot of the folks in office who, supported those Medicaid cuts are not popular right now. And, because of these types of budget cuts, right? It's going to affect people. It's going to hurt people. It's specifically going, those budget cuts to Medicaid will specifically hurt disabled people. And I think that it's not a coincidence that after that passed, or kind of in conjunction with these huge Medicaid cuts passing, that there are also proposals to pass legislation that would specifically make it very difficult for disabled people to vote, despite being eligible to vote. So trying to keep eligible voters from voting because they are probably not happy with recent choices by a lot of our elected officials. So on the next slide here, just kind of digging into that a little bit more. We have 74,296 people. That's like the average number of people living in Pennsylvania skilled nursing facilities in 2025. And I specifically call out skilled nursing facilities because I do voter registration work and vote by mail work in nursing facilities. They're legally required to help residents or, short and long-term residents staying in those facilities to help them vote. But in my experience, a lot of these facilities are not very effective at providing that support for a lot of reasons that doesn't really make sense to go into right this second. But in my work, I try to partner with these facilities and teach their staff how to do voter registration drives in the most efficient way and the most effective way at the same time, right? To really ask every person before every election if they're interested in voting, and if they are, to get them voting. A lot of times it's by mail-in ballot. A vast majority of the people I've worked with in nursing facilities, I could probably count on one hand the number of people who voted in person. The other several hundred preferred to vote by mail. Or rather, it was the easiest, it was the most accessible option for them. And it's much better than an absentee ballot, because an absentee ballot requires a doctor's signature, and which adds another signature, more approval, more gatekeeping for an adult who has the legal right to vote. It's ridiculous. So the reason I have this number on my screen, 74,296, like I said, on average, that's the number of people living in Pennsylvania skilled nursing facilities in 2025. On the next slide here, I have 72.69%. That is the Medicaid occupancy rate of Pennsylvania skilled nursing facilities. So depending on how you count folks, how you consider long-term versus short-term, about 2/3 of people, close to 3/4, living in nursing facilities in Pennsylvania have their care funded by Medicaid long-term services. And so, again, back to my slide about our Medicaid budget cuts and our proposed voting legislation, it's not a coincidence that at the same time that Medicaid cuts are being proposed, that the rights of disabled voters are also being threatened. And I also want to point out that the monthly personal needs allowance of Medicaid beneficiaries living in skilled nursing facilities is $60 a month. That is the amount of money one person has in a month to pay for hygiene products, shampoo, toothpaste, to get clothing, to buy a gift for a friend or a family member for Christmas or a birthday gift, to pay their phone bill, to, buy a tablet. It is very hard to save money. It is very hard to renew your license when it is $40 and you only have $60 a month to spend on any of your given needs, right? So next, on this slide, I have a quote here. It says, "It will guarantee the midterms. If you don't get it, big trouble." This is a quote from our current president about the Save America Act, trying to encourage our House of Representatives or Congresspeople to support the Save America Act, despite the fact that it would probably make them very unpopular with their constituents. The reason I point this out is because the midterms are this year. This is a very big election in Pennsylvania. There's always an election happening because we have one every 6 months. But this is a big one. The midterm elections mean a lot of Congress people either staying in their positions and status quo or getting some new folks in there. And it's very clear that the point of the Save America Act and the SAVE Act and the MEGA Act is to keep eligible voters from actually voting. It's also no coincidence that there is no budget for this act. Like, most laws have a budget attached to them, and the SAVE Act, the Save America Act, and the MEGA Act have no budget. There's no funding to get everybody a voter ID or a photo ID or to cover the cost of people's, birth certificate replacements, because that would enable people to vote. All right. So next, I'm going to take a drink of my water and we'll kind of move on to the last part of the slideshow presentation here. So the slide on the screen says Democratic Breakdown and Resilience. So what does all of this have to do with voting? Well, as I've been alluding, autocrats use elections to consolidate power, sometimes to one party or a small group within a party, or sometimes just one individual. They try to subvert elections by doing things like gerrymandering between the census. Normally when gerrymandering happens, it's okay, a new census has passed and we're going to do this. But it's been going on in the last couple of years. And that's very uncommon, like very, very uncommon. So gerrymandering, but mid-census gerrymandering is specifically weird. Keeping qualified candidates from running for office by disqualifying them. Other ways that autocrats like to subvert elections would be through misinformation, all of the voter disenfranchisement we talked about for the last 30 minutes, corruption, bribery, buying votes, voter intimidation, intimidation and threats to election administrators as well. I don't know if you all know this, but our election administrators receive so many death threats. Their jobs are very hard. A lot of times they have to deal with kind of angry or frustrated people because it's not easy to register to vote. When people are contacting them, it's with an issue, and they don't get paid very well. But they are literally, it is their job to protect our democracy. And it's a very thankless job. It's a hard job. It's not paid very well. And people have threats on their lives, and it's increasing turnover, which has an impact on the training level of our current election administrators. It's very tough for them right now. So be nice to your election administrators. Other ways that autocrats subvert elections are through political violence, surveillance, crackdowns on independent media and civil society. So I think recently we've had a few cases of different comedians who talk about, politics and current events, threatened or had their shows canceled because they said something that, whichever elected official in power did not like. Also recently, I think FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, passed some concerning laws related to so there are different laws that apply to comedy shows versus the news, and people who do accurate comedy about politics are under serious scrutiny right now, and we should all be concerned about that. Also, declaring an emergency to delay an election is a thing that other autocrats have done to gain and consolidate power. So this next slide, I have another diagram. I'm just talking kind of about the, on one end here we have like democratic resilience, and then we have democratic breakdown, and then the onset of autocratization, which is such a hard word to say. And then on the far right, we have autocratization. So this is kind of just the spectrum of where you can be in terms of democracy versus autocracy. So, democratic resilience, this is like the ability for a democracy to uphold and withstand external and internal stressors, or to like rebound after facing a threat from, like within their own government. Democratic breakdown is when the regime ceases to uphold democratic qualities and becomes an electoral autocracy, or even like a closed autocracy, right? Voting still happens, but is it a real election? Then we have the onset of autocratization. So when a regime starts to register negative changes that eventually become substantial and significant. So these are things like, these can include like military police states, and those things happen kind of slowly and insidiously, but then suddenly they're all around us. That's kind of what they mean there. And then autocratization is just, right, that whole process of a regime transformation in which a country becomes significantly less democratic. So we're kind of getting to that like democratic breakdown right now. But we can totally go back. We can do democratic resilience. We can be a normal, healthy democracy again. It will just take some time. Not even some time. It will take some effort to get there and to stay there. So some important things to know about democratic resilience. On the screen here, we have 3 different factors that improve democratic resilience. So one of them is institutional safeguards. This includes a strong and independent judiciary, fighting disinformation before elections, electoral integrity. The next section would be like our societal collective action. So this like strong unified opposition among civil society, right? All of those folks who were out in the streets or on the virtual No King's Day rallies, that is kind of what we're talking about. So that includes those like mass pro-democracy protests. When people say, oh, walking around in the street doesn't do anything. Yes, it does. It helps you identify other people who are aligned with you. It helps you grow this strong, unified opposition in like our everyday society. And we need to be opposing these like threats to our rights in our everyday society. And also international support for democracy is a type of societal collective action that really improves outcomes here. And the other thing when we talk about democratic resilience is timing. So the sooner the better, the sooner we start, the better our outcomes can be, and also sustained efforts. So I bring all of this up because I know that voting isn't everything, and yet it is so crucial right now. It's not the only thing, but it is so crucial, and I just want to highlight that for a few more minutes here. So, The reason we focus so much on elections when we are talking about moving from that like kind of democratic backslide back into, you know, a real like resilient democratic society is because elections provide an opportunity for autocrats to lose or gain power. Because, you know, if you are comparing, right, like there are a lot of different ways to get out of this. We can have effective elections to rebound our democracy. Other things that have happened in other countries include some really scary stuff, like a coup or a civil war, and we don't want to do that. It is scary, it is dangerous, it is also not as effective. We know that democratically elected societies sustain longer term. It's a much more effective way to get the rebound that we want and to move back into a healthy democracy compared to some of those scarier options. So we can get involved. We have to get involved. There's truly like no other option. One way you can get involved, election related. So most of this slide here is just election related ways to get involved, plus some non-election stuff as well. So one, you can sign up to be a poll worker on election day. You do have to be a registered voter in your county to be a poll worker in that county. But you should totally sign up to be a poll worker on election day. You will get paid. It's not a competitive rate because it is like a 16-hour day, but it is so, so important. Everyone should be a poll worker at least once. Volunteer with Keystone Progress Education Fund. I'm going to plug myself here. I mentioned before that we do, you know, voter registration and vote by mail drives in skilled nursing facilities, and that work is so, so important because so many people, specifically so many disabled people, end up in nursing facilities, don't plan to be there long term, and then get stuck and are just sequestered from the rest of society and very easily like lose touch with their people and, you know, the resources they have out in the community. And it's really important to make sure that everyone who can vote, who wants to vote, does, and to remind people that, you know, yes, voting is like registering to vote is kind of unnecessarily difficult, but there are lots of people who are well trained, and you could be well trained by me to help people through that process. So that way, whether they're in a nursing facility, short or long term, they can vote in the upcoming election. Because I've seen so many people who get into a facility, plan to be there short term, so they just miss one election, and then 2 years later, they still live there and they haven't been voting. Another way that folks can get involved is by volunteering with Access Mob. So we have a Ballots for Patients program. During the week leading up to an election, folks can actually get an emergency absentee ballot. This is really especially relevant for people who are hospitalized, you know, at the last minute, they plan to vote in person, or they can't get back home to get their mail-in ballot. No one has a key to their house. We can get an emergency absentee ballot in that case, and we can actually work with individuals and local hospitals and the local county elections offices to make that happen. It's, you know, it's kind of a lift for like 4 or 5 days leading up to the election, but it is so worth it to help people vote. There's another organization here I want to point out, which is Promote the Vote Pennsylvania. They have 2 very cool programs. So they have one program where you can give a ride to voters to help them get to the county elections office, to the drop boxes, or to the polls so that they can vote, whether in person at the polls or by mail. They also have a designated agent program. So for voters who cannot obtain or return their mail-in ballot or their emergency mail-in ballot, they actually have trained volunteers who can act as a designated agent to basically carry your ballot for you from the elections office to you, or from you back to the elections office or your drop box or the mailbox, however you need their help. But they are trained to help people who are not able to get their ballot themselves. They can help you with that. And those are two really, really cool programs that anyone can volunteer for. The first one, you do need to have access for a car, obviously. Another organization to volunteer with is Election Protection. So they have a hotline. The hotline is really just for legal professionals, so law students, attorneys, obviously, and also legal aides and stuff, paralegals. Those folks are so helpful for the hotline, especially if you know multiple languages. Extremely helpful. So if someone has an issue voting and they are either confused or worried that their rights are being infringed on, or know that their rights are being infringed on, they can call the Election Protection Hotline and get some assistance with that. The Election Protection also has a poll monitoring program. So if you are interested in going to polling places in your area to see if they are doing what they're supposed to be doing, that they're not infringing on people's rights. One example of this would be, going in and checking to make sure the accessible ballot marking device is set up when the polling place opens, not when someone gets there halfway through the day and it takes 45 minutes just to turn on. And then suddenly it takes somebody an hour or more to vote because the staff did not follow the rules. That's just one example of how poll monitoring can help, because you can point out those issues and make sure they get addressed before they become a problem for an actual voter. Another way to get involved would be submitting a letter to the editor of your local newspaper. Whether it's election related or not, it's really important to share your thoughts with elected officials and to share your thoughts with your community members. There are a lot more of us out here who are concerned about each other's safety and each other's rights, and we have to talk to each other and find each other. And then I just have a couple more notes here. So I know we started to get a little heavy there talking about democratic breakdown and resilience. I'm going to give you one more heavy moment and then it will get better, I promise. So a study over the last 20 years or so looked at all of these democracies across the world that had started backsliding, similar to the territory that we're starting to get into now here in the United States. The countries that had this democratic breakdown with no civil resistance movement, right? So no people getting in the streets and yelling, no people writing letters to their editor, people not going out to volunteer and to make sure we keep our rights. Only about 7.5% of those got back to a normal, healthy democracy through an election alone. But when you do the election, because you have to do the election, that is how people stay in power or they lose their positions of power. When you do that and combine it with a large, strong civil resistance movement, actually more than half of those countries do that U-turn and get back into a healthy democracy. So lots of countries have done this. We have lots of data about how it's done, and we're on the right track because so many people were out in the streets over the weekend and have been participating in mutual aid, have been speaking up about important things and paying attention at times when maybe we previously would not have. So we have to get involved in a lot of other ways outside of related to the election and also outside of the election. And we also have to stay involved. So that is kind of my big takeaway is elections won't, voting won't fix everything. It can't. And we do need it to get back to a healthy place. And then we have to sustain that momentum to build the world together that we actually all want and need to thrive. All right, I think I'm done. Does anyone have any questions?
Hi, this is Elisa coming back. If anyone has any questions, either raise your hand using the raise hand function, or if you are on your phone, you can hit *9. You can also type your question into the chat for our moderator to read out loud. We have one hand up. Donna, please unmute yourself.
Mallory, this may be a hard question to answer, but what are activities that people can do virtually to help strengthen voter protections?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so there's so much you can do virtually to strengthen voter protections. Like I said, those letters to the editor, you can write that at home. You can do phone banking for organizations. Keystone Progress Education Fund does not have a phone banking program at the moment, but there's tons of other organizations, like pro-democracy organizations that do, like us, nonpartisan work, reminding people to check their voter registration, checking to see if folks have a plan to vote. Are you voting by mail or are you voting in person? Okay, well, the deadline to figure that out is coming up. What do you think is going to work best for you? And that can be done over text or by phone. The way those programs work is you basically kind of get involved as a volunteer with any kind of civic engagement organization that does pro-democracy work, and they can get you set up with a little bit of technology, but usually using your own phone, just like different apps to do that kind of work. Let's see what else. I know a lot of folks do mutual aid work and just sharing information. I know there are lots of signal chats around where people are sharing information specifically about what's going on in their neighborhood. Those are all really great ways to get involved with your people around you. You can do it from your house. That's totally fine. Not everyone can or should be confronting the police at all times, but it is really important for people's safety that we do this other background work to make sure people have what they need to stay safe, to stay connected, and to enact their rights. So I love that question.
Thank you, Donna. That was a great question. Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, seeing none, could you go to the next slide, please, Mel?
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, everyone who came out tonight, or everyone who's watching this later on the Zoom, or not the Zoom, I'm sorry, the YouTube. We have our upcoming events listed on the slide right now. You can find all of these except for one on accessmobpittsburgh.org. There's a tab up top that says Community Lecture Night. Click on that, go down, and it's all under 2026. So Monday, May 18th from 6 to 7:30. We have Tassana Jones doing a talk on More Than Words, Empowering Nonverbal Youth Through Multimodal Communication Access. On Monday, July 27th, we have Monica Still doing Empowered Esports. And on Monday, September 28th, we are the talk that was originally scheduled for tonight, Thinking Outside the Box, Employment and Persons with Disabilities. We will be doing that then. We also have on Saturday, September 26th from 12 p.m. to 4 p.m., Disability Pride Pittsburgh. You'll be hearing more about that on our newsletter and whatnot, but it is a great way to come together and celebrate the disability community, and just, be together. And then the final slide, please. So Access Mob Pittsburgh, we run, we are a 501c3. We run fully on grant funding and donations, and we, thrive on getting contributions from people who attend our lectures. On the screen right now are QR codes to our PayPal, Cash App, and Venmo. You can find all these also on accessmobpittsburgh.org/donate. And there will be links in the chat for that. Yeah, that's kind of all my thought from there. So, once again, I want to thank Mal for giving such a deeply insightful lecture. I learned a whole lot tonight. As always, I want to thank Debbie, Donna, Kendra, Mallory, Monica, Nyota, and Reggie for all the hard work that you do. Katie for being our meeting manager and host. Thank you, Disability Pride Pennsylvania, for just being an outstanding organization that helps us out, and Opportunity Fund for providing us the grant funding to run this wonderful lecture series. Thank you all so much and have a great night.